Okay. Uh, First of all, I just like to say that when we talk about schools of psychology, when we talk about school of thought, right? It's a particular way of viewing things, or it's a particular way of uh, understanding things, right? We come back to philosophy when it comes to this. I am so sorry, but yes, we do come back to philosophy because when you very boil it down very much from the layman perspective, when you talk about my life ki philosophy kya hai, or what is your philosophy of life, you get to know certain rules and values and certain uh, ways of thinking about the world and ways of understanding the world, right? We all have our own distinct ways of you know understanding how the world functions, how we function, what is the goal of life, what is the purpose of life. For a lot of us, religion fulfills a lot of those, existential questions of sorts, right? So a school of thought is basically coming from philosophy where there is a patterned way of thinking about when we come to psychology school of thought, there's a patterned way of thinking about uh, psychological processes, what is mind, what are humans, and what is human behavior, where does it come from, all of those ideas, right? And we have significant diversity when it comes to this thing, right? When it comes to this idea that, okay, what is the mind and what are people like and what do people want from their lives, right? What do you want from your life? Come on. Or rather, let me ask this question. Okay, from the schools of thought that you know of in psychology, which do you feel is the most relatable for you, right? For example, the first time I heard or I read about psychodynamic and psychoanalysis, I was like, I was interested in the id ego, superego, for sure. I was like, okay, there can be certain unconscious things. But then it came to psychosexual stages and things got weird. So tell me, which do you relate most with, school of thought wise? I'm not talking about therapy, I'm talking about psychology in general. Psychodynamic only. Okay, humanistic existential. Can you give me one thing that you relate with or agree with in this, in the option that you've chosen? We said the idea concept of the unconscious, okay, that there are certain things which are not very observable to us about our own ways of thinking or our own ways of feeling and why we do certain things. Right. Khushi said humanistic because it focuses on individual experiences. Existential life is meaningless. Lol. No, I would say existential does not. Okay, some people may come to existential with that belief that life is meaningless. But what existential purpose is, life has the meaning that you give to it. It does not have inherent meaning, right? Inherent meaning that applies to everybody. Life is what you make of it and what meaning you derive from it. So your purpose, though you are not some prophesized or fate is pushing you or something, like you're not the chosen one, but there is so much liberation and freedom in existential, says that okay, there is also fear for sure, but there is also liberation in this idea that you can create your own meaning, right? Noor said same. Okay, Unnati said egos function. Kushi said I know I can't be optimistic. Okay. Okay. Yeah, ठीक है. I didn't get that Hannah Montana reference. I'm so sorry. Okay. Moving on. See, there are certain technical parts about this. I don't like to teach to the test. That is I don't want to have this thing I'm covering everything that is there for this unit. I will try to, but that is not my goal. My goal is that you understand the concept so much that you can develop on it and you can kind of understand and you're not left in the dark, right? Because you don't know what are the basic building blocks, right? Okay, so we'll cover today structuralism, functionalism, psychoanalysis, These are schools of thought that have influenced psychology at certain points of time, right? Psychoanalysis, Gestalt, behaviorism, humanistic, existential, transpersonal, cognitive revolution, and multiculturalism, right? Many of these were movements were happening coincidentally also. Like humanistic and existential was very hand in hand. Some of them were very antagonistic towards each other, and some of them are like very opposite of or like a thesis antithesis way of being. For example, structuralism and functionalism. Structuralism and Gestalt especially were very opposites, polar opposites. But humanistic and existential went very hand in hand. Even the founders were some of the same people were involved, right? Maslow was involved in humanistic. Maslow was also involved in existential, establishing the existential school of thought, right? Why I've written yours here because it has been a significant question. Okay, like what came first? So usually the main schools are asked about. Okay, structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, and humanistic. Right. So if you get a sequence-wise question, this is the answer: structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, and then humanistic. Okay. Moving on. Okay, trying to move on, but not happening. Okay. Yes. So when it comes to structuralism, we talk about the elements of the mind. It's a very reductive approach in the sense that we were trying to find out कि if we can bifurcate the processes or the behavior into its constituent parts, then we can find out truly what is mind and what is consciousness. It was founded by Wilhelm Wundt. He called it voluntarism, right? Voluntarism referred to this idea of exploring the self and actually, in a way, like, introspection was a tool that was used in structuralism a lot. Wundt was also the first person who or the person who established the first lab in Leipzig, Germany, right? Uh, what would be done is by the method of introspection, there would be a metronome in front of the student, and every student would be exposed to that same stimulus. A metronome is this thing which goes tuck, 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 tuck in front of you. You may have seen it. If you have not seen it, just Google it later, right? And the participants were told to blurt out or introspect about everything that is happening in their mind, in their head, emotion wise, feeling wise, perception wise, etc. Right? And they try to figure out, okay, what's happening and what is the process behind these major psychological happenings, right? How we know structuralism today was expanded by Edward Titchener, right? What this did was, though it was very, what do you say, though this is not very experimental rigor oriented, right? But what Wundt did was make psychology experimental and move it or kind of establish it as an experimental science, right? Okay, something that is observable and this idea of control. Everybody will get the same condition, standardization, right? This idea was introduced by Wundt in psychology, right? यहाँ से from here we start with the bifurcation of psychology or the division of psychology from philosophy. Psychology as a discipline of science and experimental study, right? Of course, there is still controversy about whether it's an art, humanities, science subject, but still, okay. That was the benefit of structuralism. The main principles were breaking down or reducing thoughts and sensations into constituent elements, right? What is this made of? For example, if I'm trying to remember something, what do I do, right? I am trying to think of the situation first. I am setting the context. Second is I am trying to place the characters, the people who were involved at that time, right? And then I'm trying to visualize it, right? So these are three components that are happening when I'm trying to remember something. That is something that a structuralist would be interested in. Primary relied on introspection. Okay, what's happening within you, you should know. Now you understand the limitation of this, right? Okay, We are not always aware of the processes that are happening inside us, right? Studied various mental processes such as perception, sensation, memory, etc. Again, brought back the experimental method, brought back, like, or rather introduced the experimental method and brought back psychology as into the forum of science, right? Titchener was the one who coined structuralism. And basically, he did this thing, okay, analysis of basic elements that constitute the mind, right? Functionalism asked a very different question. Did not ask, like, what are the component parts or what are the elements of this process. Functionalism asks, what is the purpose? For what purpose? Why? Why are these behaviors existing? Why do these behaviors happen? Right? Rather than examining the mental processes themselves, functionalists investigated their roles and purposes. Now you can see it was very heavily influenced by Darwinian ideas of evolution, right? The purpose, adaptation, survival. Why have we developed emotions? Because of survival, because it enhances cooperation, because it builds community, it signals distress, right? And on the work of William James. William James had worked in the area of consciousness as a very important site of inquiry. What makes consciousness, right? Other influences were Edward Thorndike when he tried to do this, conduct experiments on trial and error learning, right? Why do we do these things? How do we achieve it, right? If I am trying to learn something or if I am trying to move towards something, why is that? What purpose does it serve? What is the function, right? They use methods like observational studies, case studies, and experiments. So you understand how they're very observational in their idea, right? And they are trying to find out where does this fit in the larger game of survival, right? In turn, influenced applied psychology, behavioral psychology, evolutionary psychology, and educational psychology, right? Functionalists primarily believe that we should look at what purpose does action or this process, emotional process or cognitive process, what function does this serve? Then we come to psychoanalysis, right? Now I'm going chronologically, but functionalism के बाद Gestalt is one of the bigger schools of thought. Psychoanalysis happened simultaneously in a way, but I would say Gestalt is more closer to a larger school of thought, like I said earlier also, right? So we'll cover Gestalt. Gestalt was strictly anti-structuralist. It is, so for example, like I've written here, see, 2 plus 2 is equal to 5, right? A structuralist would lose their shit over this. But a Gestalt psychologist would be like, yeah, sure, it can be, right? Let me give you an example. Think about your friends. There are different kinds of friendships that people have, right? Um, some of you may have group friendships, right? One group that has like 4 or 5 members at least, and or like triad भी हो सकता है and dyad भी हो सकता है. Some people prefer only one best friend. Some people have like 4 or 5 best friends or like a group, etc. Identify yourselves. Then you go from having one best friend. Is having two best friends the same thing as being in a group of three? Is the experience of it same? No. What's different? What's different? Come on. Okay, messages are reaching me a little later. Difference in the two friends' attitudes towards us versus two best friends towards me. Okay, okay. So basically, yeah. So when you are in a group, the group is also an entity, right? And it's not just you who is the connecting point, right? And there are other multiple of structuralists who try to break this down. But a Gestalt uh, psychologist would try to understand that the parts may be different. There may be people who are different and who have different personalities, etc. And as individuals in other groups, they may have different ways of being, right? And but this group as an entity is something different. The sum of the parts or the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So here you can see, okay, if you put 2.4 plus 2.4, when you reduce a decimal, it's 2 only, right? But if you consider 4.8, that will be 5, right? Just a neat trick to show how Gestalt psychologists may be okay in their logic, right? Very heavily anti-structuralist. Gestalt influences were greatly from other philosophies. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe used this uh, method of phenomenology, right? And he was not a primarily sorry, one second. Yeah. He was not primarily a psychologist, right? Immanuel Kant, Ernst Mach, all of these people who are not involved in psychology were people who were great influences. These are philosophers, right? Gestalt psychologists use the method of phenomenology, the description of direct psychological experience with no restrictions on what can be included. Certain important people when it comes to Gestalt as okay. So sorry, am I audible? I think my phone disconnected. Okay, okay, thank you. When it comes to Gestalt psychology, there is a difference that you need to know. Gestalt psychotherapy and Gestalt psychology are not related to each other. Gestalt, the idea of a Gestalt is more primarily when you say that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's more of a psychology in the sense the experimental psychology side of it, right? And Gestalt psychotherapy would go in the humanistic school of thought, actually speaking, right? What Gestalt psychology did was primarily give a boost to uh, experimental studies of sensation, perception, visual perception, especially, right? When it comes to these illusions that you see, say, you perceive movement where there is no movement, right? Those circles, concentric circles, where if you look at one point for a long time, then all the other circles vanish, or you suddenly see movement when there is no movement as such, right? So, Gestalt psychologists prompted this new area of study, and a lot of studies and a lot of experimentation was done on perception and sensation, right? The five phenomenon is when, like I said, in illusions, when there is an illusion of movement where there is no movement, right? Wolfgang Kohler did a lot of studies in problem solving. Kurt Kafka did a lot of studies in perception and learning, especially perception when it comes to hearing impaired people, right? How do they perceive, right? There was this very interesting variation of true effect study for visually impaired people. So it used different textures and braille, right? So Gestalt psychologists really put a boost in the experimentation and in study of perception studies, right? Though we may think that, so they are trying to capture the whole and not the part. Okay, has the slide changed? Okay, I want to go back to, huh. Okay, we'll go to behaviorism, then we'll move on to psychoanalysis. Okay, we've gone to back. I'm so sorry, there's just this network connectivity issue because of the rain. Okay. Then came behaviorism, right? Now, behaviorism, I would say any psychologist that follows the idea of behaviorism is a proponent of this idea of the observer, right? What is measurable and what is definable and what is observable. So I would say that these are observers. Go back. Hmm. This is born out of the limitations of structuralism and functionalism. And this was like a formal school of thought that was developed by Watson and Skinner, right? This idea behind this was psychology should only measure what is observable and measurable, right? So internal thoughts, internal states, etc., all of those are beyond psychology, beyond the scope of psychology, rather, right? The the impetus or the pivotal moment for behaviorism was when Watson published Psychology as the Behaviorist Use It, right? There are certain tenets within behaviorism. One is that behaviorists posited that human behavior could be understood and predicted through stimulus-response relationships. Stimulus-response relationships, we are talking about classical and operant conditioning, asserting that all behaviors are learned via interactions with the environment. This idea of or concept of tabula rasa or blank slate. I hope you are aware of it. It's this idea that children and people in general are born with no inherent capacities or inherent tendencies or vulnerabilities also as such, right? When it comes to mental processes, but whatever they learn from the environment. Now, right off the bat, we notice that there are so many limitations here because so many of our uh, abilities and our circumstances are genetic, right? There are, for example, there is a very strong genetic component to aggression. We know that, right? It's a very behavioral response, but there's a strong component to aggression. Even when taken into, so even when children are taken out of parents or taken from or put into homes that do not have or do not practice aggression, right? Children still exhibit aggression as adults also, right? So there is a very strong correlation, or rather, there's a very strong component of to aggression and certain other behavioral principles also, right? So many other things it does not explain, right? But what the behaviorist school of thought did was it brought back this idea of respect to psychology, right? This idea that okay, most of the most famous studies that you hear about are in the area of behaviorism because whatever is observable and whatever is not abstract, right, is much more palatable, hazam ho jata hai, right, more digestible. So there was that, and there was the concept of blank slate. They also posited this idea that if we are studying behavior and behavior is same across all animals, then there should not be such a distinction between non-human animals and us, right, and humans. So there was this born out of behaviorist school of thought, this idea of comparative psychology. There was a neglect of biological and innate factors. For example, Noam Chomsky famously has criticized B.F. Skinner and the behaviorist movement because Noam Chomsky has this idea that there is an innate aptitude for language acquisition within humans that is very special to us, right? And to some other mammals. So yeah, there are certain limitations, and then we'll just cover the basic classical and operant conditioning tools. So we come to classical conditioning, which is basically the dog experiment, where I just yeah, okay. So the experiment with the dog, where Pavlov basically tried to do this thing where if a dog was shown food and it was hungry, it would salivate, right? And then after showing food, or before showing food rather, he would ring a bell. And after a few trials of this, the dog would start salivating not at the sight of the uh, food, but rather at the ringing of the bell only, because those two things became associated closely together, right? So the idea is that behaviors are learned through association, associating neutral stimuli with naturally triggering stimuli, so that the neutral stimuli evokes the same response, right? Why was Pavlov's hair so smooth? Classical conditioning. Yes. Very dad joke, but it will help you remember. Pavlov had like a full set of hair also. You'll remember that it's classical conditioning. It's very classic. That's it, right? And operant conditioning, Skinner worked on the idea of positive and negative reinforcement. Reinforcement refers to this idea that when you want the behavior to happen again, reinforcing a behavior. And there were also components of positive and negative punishment, right? So if you reward something or you take away something non-pleasurable, right, then the behavior is likely to repeat. The major distinction between these two approaches is that one talks about involuntary behaviors. When it comes to classical conditioning, we are talking largely about involuntary behaviors. And when it comes to operant conditioning, we are talking about voluntary behaviors, right? Greatly influenced behavioral therapy. Gestalt के जैसा यहाँ पर नहीं है. Behaviorism influenced behavioral therapies a lot, right? Techniques like systematic desensitization, token economies, reinforcement based learning, right? Applied behavioral analysis also, but Skinner increasingly became anti punishment as he found that there was not a lot of evidence supporting this idea that punishment actually alters behavior, right? And like I said, Noam Chomsky heavily criticized Skinner in his papers because of this idea that behaviorism is unscientific. Okay, you stopped 1 second, just 1 second. Okay, I'm so sorry. I think I'll have to continue from my phone because my laptop just is crashing. Okay, can you see my screen now? Okay, great. Okay. Then we'll come to the schools of thought where there was a lot of influence on psychotherapy, right? Okay. So 1900s onwards, right? Psychoanalysis became a very defining feature or defining idea or concept of psychology. Even today, when you talk about it, when you talk about psychology, often people know Freud's name, right? Often dubbed the father of psychotherapy, right? Sigmund Freud in 1900 uh, published the interpretation of dreams, and from that point onwards, his popularity soared. The idea behind psychoanalysis is that there are unconscious desires and unconscious processes happening, and when it came to treatment of abnormal behaviors, right, bringing these repressed ideas and repressed drives into consciousness will provide relief, right? Then Freud also gave the components of the psyche as id, ego, superego. Id working on the very pleasure principle of it all, whatever it wants, right? Think of whenever you think of id, you think of a kid, right? The kid wants what it wants. There is no navigating it. There is no to put their hand in the plug point in an electrical outlet, right? And then their parents shouting at them or like telling them, okay, okay, don't do that. Then the child waiting, okay, when the parents will go, I will do that, right? That is a very classic sign of development of the ego. Okay, reality principle. How do we go about navigating reality, and how do we satisfy the id? If you talk about certain things, things will become better and things will resolve, right? Psychoanalysis also provided us with the psychosexual stages of personality development. We have the neo-Freudians, Eric Fromm and Karen Horney, that also came from the psychoanalytic tradition. Psychoanalytic tradition psychologists basically asked this idea of what's hidden, right? If I could put it in one sentence, I would say, okay, they are interested in what's hidden. What is so unacceptable that it's hidden, right? Then there were so many people who branched out from psychoanalysis and said, okay, like, okay, this is not how I see the theory of mind playing out, right? And we have Carl Jung, we have so many other people, we have Maslow also, we have Rogers also, right? Many great people who developed or developed an antithesis even to psychoanalysis. right? Now we move on to the humanistic. I would say these are the humanizers, right? These were people who developed, these were psychologists who developed this school of thought in response to behaviorism and psychoanalysis. They felt like uh, people are being considered as data points, or only abnormal behavior is being considered, right? Precursors were also the fact that there was a lot of abuse happening in institutions of care where people were supposed to be taken care of, right? This was called the third force in psychology after behaviorism and psychoanalysis. It emphasized on the positive aspects of human psychology and drive, appreciation of individual experiences and uniqueness, and wanted to find out what could make a healthy person instead of just lack and abnormality, right? When you think of humanizers, when you think of humanistic, you think Abraham Maslow, you think Carl Rogers, right? These were people who were trying to answer this question: okay, what do people want, and how do people navigate their life, and not just about what is unhealthy, but what is healthy, right? So they arrived at this idea that realizing your potential or being your full self, right, is what people are striving towards. Humanistic psychology is a very value driven school of thought, right? It sees people as inherently good, which is in contrast with some other schools of thought, right? For example, existential school of thought does not assign this idea of good and not good also. Humanistic psychology talks about this fact that everybody has a drive to become better and to become the best versions of more actualized versions of themselves, right? Can you see my video? No, oh, you can't. Sorry. Okay, and I can't share my video when I'm sharing my screen. Sorry about that. Okay. It's basically summed up very well in this idea that the humanist is concerned with the fullest growth of the individual in the areas of love, fulfillment, self-worth, and autonomy, right? Maslow was the founding father with his hierarchy of needs, emphasizing what is needed for the individual to achieve their full potential, right? But also Maslow also interacted with a lot of Native American communities before arriving at that, and there is some controversy that now that Maslow took this idea from Native Americans, right? But still, the impact that it had in a time where we were only talking about abnormal behaviors and what causes dysfunction, to ask the question, okay, what do people want, and what are people striving towards, and what is a healthy individual, right? Right. These were important questions at that point, right? And they influenced a lot of research. They influenced a lot of different schools of thought. Even counseling came from a very humanistic idea. Rogers influenced by the works of Otto Rank, who was a close colleague of Freud again, right? Rogers published significant aspects of client-centered therapy, which is one of the most famous, or like rather, it is so fundamental, or it is considered so fundamental that client-centered therapy techniques are considered as basic skills, right? The concept of self was also a significant point. Humanistic psychologists, as and when they went about, they found that how people looked at themselves or how people defined themselves, right, was very important in how their personality grew, right? And how, what kind of sense did they make of their experiences, right? This provided this idea that, okay, the meaning derived with the self and this idea of the self in the head, right? Regardless of what the self is outside. Here is where the branching happened into existential psychology, right? Perception defines personality and behavior is one thing that they found out. The Association for Humanistic Psychology was found in 1962. This can be a question that can be asked. It was asked once. I think not humanistic psychology, but when were certain? associations formed, or when were certain journals which were very defining were they when were they established, right? Then we come to existential or the meaning makers, right? These people did not ask. So where humanistic and existential would differ is that humanistic has this idea of a person as a good person. Existentialism does not make that mistake, right? Or rather considers it a mistake to ignore the parts which may not be good. It even questions this idea of what is good and what is bad, right? What meaning do you derive out of your experience, out of your own life, out of, what is the purpose of life according to you? These were the large questions that existentialism asked. Many humanistic psychologists were involved in existential schools of thought, and development of existential school of thought started with humanistic psychologists only. Soren Kierkegaard is considered the father of existentialism. He famously had given this maxim that I exist, therefore I think. In contrast to Descartes, I think, therefore I am, giving a very opposite of rationalist idea. I exist, therefore I think. Ludwig Binswanger applied existential philosophy to psychotherapy, focused on the themes of meaning, free will, responsibility, and the search for the purpose of life. Right? All of these became defining factors of what is a person, what is mind, right? It's not Rollo Mayolo, I'm so sorry. Rollo Mayo, Rollo May was also a very significant contributor to existential school of thought. He wrote Love and Life, which is a seminal work in existential therapy. Viktor Frankl also provided man's search for meaning, right? Then we come to, from existential, we come to a very closely associated, right? Humanistic existential is very connected to, or rather, very foundational for transpersonal. The fourth force. Based on humanistic and existential psychology, the transpersonal focuses on something that transcends the personal, right? So anything spirituality, anything mystical related, and transcendent aspects of human experience, right? So even something as simple as this connect with God, this connect with the universe, or a connect that indigenous people or indigenous populations have with nature, right? All of this can be really well understood by transpersonal school of thought, right? Lejoie, it is called, but it will say Lejoie only. And Shapiro talked about, or they conducted a search over papers which talked about transpersonal school of thought in psychology. And they found that these were common things that were mentioned: states of consciousness, higher or ultimate potential, beyond the ego or beyond the self, transcendence, and spirituality. And whenever you see transcendence, जहाँ पर भी mentioned है, Maslow is often one of the people who talked about transcendence, right? It was a very formal establishment where Abraham Maslow, Anthony Switch, Miles Witch, Stanislav Grof, and Sonia Margolin created transpersonal psychology in a conference. They presented it as a school of thought, right? But when it comes to practice and school of thought wise, it is very closely associated with humanistic and existential. Sometimes it is also defined under existential, right? Because the existential also asks about spirituality. If spirituality is what you derive meaning out of, then transpersonal is also existential. Carl Jung was also a great influence with his theory of anima, all of those things, archetypes, etc. Right? Then a lot of this, a lot of this coincided with the so-called hippie movement in uh, the Americas, right? Lot of spirituality, lot of recreational drug use, right? All of this was happening during the humanistic existential and transpersonal. right? Freud was famously a cocaine user, right? But during these therapies, so see, you have to understand the context also in which they develop, right? What were the common ideas that people were having? What were the common things that people were talking about? What were the common experiences, right? So you can understand how humanistic, existential, and transpersonal are always talking about otherworldly experiences and consciousness and collective unconscious, all of these ideas, right? It makes sense. But then came the cognitive revolution because there was this idea that, okay, we need to bring back the scientific aspects of psychology, right? It cannot function like this and it cannot go on like this. And one very strong push for this was because of funding. Funding opportunities for something that were not very objective or something that was not very uh, observable, right, was very difficult. That is why people shifted, or rather, like scientists shifted to this idea of, like, I have to create a lab. And then, so this is what you will see in today also. Most of the labs that you see, research labs, right, are somewhere cognitively oriented, somewhere perception oriented, somewhere following the idea of behaviorism, right? Something observable, something measurable, right? Because often, like I said, there's this idea that abstract people don't understand. Observable, we can see and we can feel and we can derive some kind of data points from it, that is much more profitable or some meaning makeable rather, right? And it could be used. For example, cognitive revolution also happened during very high industrialization and very high computer usage, right? Computer usage, or rather, like corporatization of the working force, right? So this is very important to consider because this was during the time where computers came into the fore. And now we were talking about the mind also as a computer, right? Software, hardware, all of those things. The cognitive revolution happened simultaneously within many fields, and many fields came together to form the cognitive revolution. It brought back this study of mental processes of thinking, memory, perception, and problem solving to the forefront, right? The emphasis became on scientific study and experimentation. Computer science, linguistics, and anthropology, all of these fields contributed heavily to the cognitive revolution, right? When it comes to, so we'll talk about some of the people who contributed to it who were not psychologists, right? In 1960s, Harvard Center for Cognitive Studies and Center for Human Information Processing was established. One of the most, it is the most cited paper in psychology, Miller's The Magical Number 7 plus or minus 2, right? Even today, our experimentation revolves around cognitive processes, right? Noam Chomsky worked in the linguistics wala field of it. Jean Piaget worked on deriving the developmental stages of cognition for children, from childhood to adulthood, right? Ebbinghaus was also a very significant contributor. James McClelland was a computer scientist who gave this idea of parallel distributed processing, which is still used today to understand certain cognitive processes, right? Like I said, it is no coincidence that this was combined with the heavy usage of computers in corporate America then, because the idea was, if we can quantify our mind like a computer quantifies numbers and people and data, right? Then we had the multiculturalist. I think we will end in 4 minutes. Then we had the multiculturalist school of thought. Multiculturalism is not specifically a school of thought per se, but it is a movement that evoked, or rather pressurized, psychologists into considering the fact that culture is a significant variable that we are uh, ignoring in our study of the mind. Basically, that's it, right? Culture and how, like, when you think about it, groups should behave in similar ways, right? But because groups interact with each other and individuals interact with each other in different capacities, and because of their environment, cultures form, and these cultures, right, have an influence on how our cognition also works, how our emotions work, what behaviors are okay, what are not okay, right? Multiculturalism is a perspective emphasizing the importance of cultural context in understanding psychological phenomena and diversity of human experiences. Now, you take the political context of this also. When more and more psychologists who were women, who were black, who were from other races and ethnicities were coming in, that is when multiculturalism became a much more prominent school of thought, right? The whole culture fair and culture free debate started from there. This idea that all standardized tests or all IQ tests are not equal, right? And all tests have this cultural component to them because of how they are developed, right? It asked psychologists to consider the impact of culture on human behavior and understand the person in their context, right? In 1970, the Journal of Cross Cultural Psychology was established. One of the more prolific writers in multiculturalism is Daryl Wing Su, who has given who wrote so much about it. But seminal works, may you can say, Counseling the Culturally Diverse is a book that he wrote, and John Berry, who gave this idea of acculturation and acculturative strategies of people, right? Multiculturalism in a movement, as a movement, I would say, in one sentence, was on and is a perspective that is also there in Gestalt. It also comes from humanistic therapy. There is a rights based approach embedded in multiculturalism, right? So there were precursors to multiculturalism, but multiculturalism brought culture to the fore as a variable, right? Even in experimental science, even in cognitive studies, even in, so for example, cross cultural studies became very prominent, right? And in behavioral studies also, right? Multiculturalism became a very influencing factor, and it brought culture as a variable into psychology. Okay, do we have any questions? I've made the slides as explanatory as possible so that you can come back and refer to it, because this is largely information based. But I hope the differences between the schools of thought and the ways of thinking are very clear. Okay, great. No confusion, right? Because humanistic and existential can seem very similar, but they have very different, they started at different points. Okay, all right. Thank you so much.